ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
For a long time, Australia's taxation system has been set up to benefit property investors and landlords, and any attempts to change that have been shouted down. But with the generational divide in home ownership becoming more pronounced, voters are shifting their views. Today, host of Q&A and the Party Room podcast, Patricia Karvelas, on whether governments will finally be forced to make things fairer. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. PK, Bill Shorten is heading off, of course, to be the Vice-Chancellor of Canberra Uni, and we're not going to discuss his legacy or anything like that. But when he was the Labor opposition leader, he proposed, of course, big changes to taxes on housing. So I want to start with you there, back in 2019, ahead of the election. What was he telling voters then?
Well, he had a suite of quite radical reforms, especially for an opposition to take to the electorate. Couple of big ideas, and one of them included basically dealing with the tax incentives that incentivise using housing as a tax break, negative gearing and also capital gains tax concessions. And he suggested limiting the use of negative gearing to newly built homes.
I just want to make clear our commitment to our negative gearing reforms. They are future changes. If you presently negatively gear, you will not be affected by our changes, full stop. It's not fair for first home buyers not to be able to get support for when they're going for a house, and they've got to compete on an unlevel playing field with someone who might be buying their fifth or sixth investment property being subsidised by the taxpayers.
And he faced what was a whopping opposition scare campaign.
Yes.
Bill Shorten poses the greatest risk to Australia's economy in a generation.
Bill Shorten's new housing tax would take a wrecking ball to the economy. Some experts believe it could even lead to a recession. Labor, it's the bill Australia can't afford.
There were a suite of other policies, things like franking credits, which we won't go into here, which were also part of the scare campaign. So it wasn't entirely only about housing, but a big part was about housing.
Yeah, and we're going to concentrate, PK, just on this issue of negative gearing at this point. So let's just explain what that is for people who don't know, because it's a tax write-off that was costing the public purse back then something like $4 billion a year.
It's a sweet deal if you can get it.
Yeah, sure.
So simply put, negative gearing is basically where if an Australian with an investment property is losing money on that investment, then you can lower your taxable income as a result of running that property at a loss. So if you receive $26,000 in rent a year for property, but the associated expenses were $40,000, the difference is $14,000, right? So you can deduct the $14,000 from your salary and reduce the tax that you pay. So often people who are on a high tax bracket, so they want to reduce their tax that they pay, will run their property at a loss. But remember that as you own that property, if you look at Australian house prices, that property is gaining in its worth in the market. And of course, some people only have one negatively geared property, but others have many, many more. The bigger, broader point is that it creates a tax incentive, perfectly legal. I'm not demonising anyone who uses this, but it creates an incentive to do it. And guess what happens? All of the people who are desperate to buy homes to live in,
Yes.
not to make cashola from, but to just live in, are competing in some cases with people who are buying an apartment, for instance, to negatively gear. And that was the issue.
Yeah, sure. So Bill Shorten went to the 2019 election and said that is enough of that. Only newly built homes can receive that negative gearing benefit. And, well, that did not play out so well for him, did it? Because he lost the election, and part of the reason is millions of Australians actually love negative gearing.
If you've got it, you love it. And according to the Australian Tax Office, about 2.25 million taxpayers claimed deductions against rental income in 2020-21 financial year. So that gives you a sense of the scope here. Of course, the electorate elected Scott Morrison. Now, we don't know how all those people voted. That's speculation from our perspective. But you would assume that some of them thought, I don't know about this deal.
Yeah, all right. Well, you spoke to Bill Shorten about this when he announced his retirement. Does he regret taking these sort of big tax change policies to that election now?
It was always crazy brave. He accepts that he had too many of these big policies. Although, interestingly, he doesn't regret the concept. He's been careful because he remains in the cabinet until February.
Leaving aside tax policies, we do have a challenge in Australia about inequity between generations, but I have to say the inequity is not because someone's old or someone's young. It's just never been so important to have rich parents.
So Bill Shorten back then, as you say, was crazy brave. But, PK, that was 5 years ago, and I think it's pretty fair to say that the housing crisis has become a lot worse since then. So tell me about this polling that's been done for Q&A.
So we commissioned a poll via YouGov to get a temperature check on where Australians were on these big issues. You are right, 5 years, things change. The housing crisis has accelerated and become more acute. It is consistently showing up as a big issue for voters, particularly a new generation of young voters, Generation Z, who are voting, and they are very concerned. Obviously, younger millennials, older millennials also are worried. I'm not saying they're not worried, but there is obviously a big shift in that generation as well. So specifically, I do think there's been a big change. So we commissioned just to see how people feel. The weighted polling sample is about 1,500 plus voters. It shows more than 6 in 10 support abolishing negative gearing for property investors, a ban on owning more than 3 residential properties. 8 in 10 want a massive increase in social housing construction to provide median income earners affordable rentals. And interestingly, what all of those results showed me, and I don't know anyone who disagrees with that, is that there has been a seismic shift and that people don't just want tinkering around the edges, they want big change.
Yeah, absolutely. So you put these figures to the new Housing Minister, Claire O'Neill, on Q&A on Monday night. How did she respond to that?
She mentioned that election we've just talked about.
Yes.
She mentioned it and she said that the public had made it quite clear how they felt and that the government was going down a different road of trying to put all of its efforts into just building supply. So she brushed it off and said, nah, we're not going down that road. We're going down this other road, supply.
As you point out, our party took this to an election and we lost that election. In fact, the Australian people decided that they would vote for Scott Morrison over Bill Shorten. We are focusing on building more homes for Australians, and that's the one thing I can be abundantly certain is going to create.
I put it to her, which I thought was a reasonable thing to say. That was some time ago, and all of the research, Redbridge, for instance, another polling independent organisation, has also done some big polling a couple of months ago showing a huge support and change on things like negative gearing. So it's a thing. We know it's a thing. You know how we know it's a thing? Because the Greens, for instance, have jumped on it and galvanised this because they know it's a community sentiment. The Teal independents have also done the same. They're all calling for change, and you can often look at those smaller or third parties as often leading the way on some of these big changes because they're sniffing the political mood.
What about the opposition? What's it saying now on negative gearing? Has it changed its mind at all?
Well, no, not officially. So Michael Sukkar, who's the Shadow Minister for Housing, says, that they are generally a party that they say they don't like slapping taxes on to people. Now, of course, if you change negative gearing, it's not like you're putting taxes on people, but you're reducing their ability to lower their taxable income. Obviously, it would be too delicious for them, wouldn't it? If Labor were to go into this space, they would want to run another scare campaign around it. Having said that, I've spoken to Liberals, some who've put their name on the record on these issues. Keith Wallahan is one of them, an up-and-comer on the backbench, but watch that space. And he says we need to deal with this intergenerational question of the tax settings. So yes, at an official level, not a shift. If you look at the rank and file, there is. And there are those who think we need to do something bigger and more fundamental than tinkering. And I think that's across the parliament.
So this survey shows that people are more inclined to support this idea to change negative gearing in this country. But just tell me, what evidence do we have to show that scrapping it or changing it would actually reduce the cost of housing and ease the housing crisis?
Well, that's a good question. The Grattan Institute did some research and they argue it wouldn't substantially lower prices. It would be more marginal. Alan Kohler, who of course is our finance presenter here at the ABC, but, a bit of a wonk and a person that we trust, says that he does think it has a huge psychological impact on the market.
No matter what the actual mathematical impact on house prices is, whether it's 2% or what, it changed the way people thought and think about housing. And so suddenly housing, it seemed to me, became a market. And when something is a market, you end up having speculators and people investing in order to get a return, in order to build their wealth. And
it is undoubtable. I mean, just ask any first home buyer. They do go to auctions and there are people who are buying an investment property who they're competing with.
Yes.
Remember, and I reckon this is a really important point, the reason Bill Shorten at the time suggested this policy was not just about creating more housing. There's another angle here, which is making our tax system fairer. That was one of the arguments too, that some people shouldn't be able to minimise their tax compliance while average workers who don't do this are paying maximum tax. That was the argument. Now, supporters of negative gearing say that it's good for housing supply. And can I say, it's a bit column A, column B, like with everything. If you just were to cut off negative gearing overnight with no grandfathering, with no caveats, there could be unintended consequences because clearly there are people who own these properties who wouldn't have an incentive. So the idea would be where would they go and what would happen to renters?
PK, this is just one survey, of course, and it doesn't mean that when voters go to the polls they will vote in that manner. But do you really think there is a political leader out there who would be so crazy brave to bring back Bill Shorten's policies?
Right now, I think there is no evidence that the two major parties have the political courage or the political enthusiasm to take on a fight like this. But I've watched politics for a long time, as have you, Sam, and it always starts with a mood shift and then it becomes inevitable over the longer term. I think there is a view, if you look at all of the research, including YouGov, that housing should be a fundamental human right. Anyone who can turn it around, I've spoken to a couple of politicians who say this to me, the first person who can really turn this around will be a big political winner because people feel this really acutely and it makes people really angry.
Patricia Karvelas hosts Q&A on ABC TV on Monday nights, along with Radio National Breakfast. She co-hosts the Party Room podcast, which you can find on the ABC Listen app. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.